Director of the Program on Conflict Prevention and Peace Building at the American University, Associate Professor at New York University's Department of Politics, and as a professor at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. He has also been a Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Council on Foreign Relations Center for Preventive Action, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council of the United States, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Director of the European Center for Common Ground, and Project Director at the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo. He's also been the President of the Congressional Human Rights Foundation and Executive Director of the Elie Wiesel Foundation. He has authored many, many books, and he has authored many policy reports, as well as more than 100 articles in leading publications such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, International Herald Tribune, and Foreign Affairs. Dr. Phillips has also been an analyst and commentator for NBC News and for the British Broadcasting Company. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Phillips to us this afternoon. Welcome.
Well, I'm exhausted listening to that introduction. You can see I can't hold the job, otherwise I couldn't have had so many. Dr. Gersh, thank you very much for having me. It's great that you all are here. I have recently moved to Irvington, so I'm a new member of the community. Very pleased to participate with your center and to be on campus. So thanks to the provost and to you all. President Obama refuses to use the term the Islamic State. He says that the terrorist group is neither Islamic, nor is it a state. It's not Islamic because the teachings in the Holy Quran and Sunnahs don't justify the kind of criminality against civilians that is widely practiced by ISIS. And it's not a state because it doesn't control territory and it has no international recognition. He chooses instead to use the term ISIL, which refers to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. The Levant is a term from the Ottoman Empire that refers to territories that stretch from the Tigris River to the Mediterranean. I choose to use the term ISIS, which refers to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. One of the primary objectives of ISIS is to destroy the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement. In the middle of World War I, a British and a French diplomat sat down together, and I'm sure over some nice cuisine somewhere, they drew a map of the Middle East and they divided the territories between great powers. And when you look at the root of conflict in Middle Eastern countries today, many of them can be traced back to the construction of states by Sykes and Picot, states that didn't exist under the Ottoman Empire, states where there are competing sectarian groups, Sunnis and Shia, and ethnic minorities that feel as though they are captive nations. When I came here earlier, I sat down for a chat with Lauren, who is writing for the school newspaper. And she said, did you know that ISIS was founded in 1998? And that's a very good leading question. I said, you stole the opening line of my remarks. Because everyone seems to think that ISIS is a recent phenomenon. When they stormed across the barrier and seized Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, on June 10th of this year, ISIS became a household name. But in fact, there is a rather long and sordid history to ISIS that has brought it to this moment. It's a history that involves initial contact between the founder of ISIS, the ideological godfather of ISIS, a fellow named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and bin Laden in 1999. Apparently the readout of that meeting was that bin Laden didn't really get along well with Zarqawi. He thought that he was intellectually limited and too ideologically rigid. But he did allow Zarqawi and his cohorts to set up a terrorist training center in Herat in Afghanistan, where they exercised their training regime until 2001, when the Taliban was overthrown, and Zarqawi and others were forced to flee. So where did he go? He was forced out and he went to Iraq. Zarqawi is initially Jordanian. He comes from a Jordanian village called Zarqan, just outside of Amman. When the U.S. invaded and occupied Iraq in 2003, Zarqawi established something called Jamaat al-Tawhid al-Jihad, which is a party of monotheism and jihad. It later was renamed Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004. And Zarqawi took on a proportion greater than life through a practice that he initiated, which was the beheading of captives, filmed and broadcast over their social networks. This recruited people to his organization. It also earned him a reputation as particularly fierce among the Sunni tribes that were opposing the U.S. occupation, and who also were involved in conflict between Sunnis and Shia in Iraq. Zarqawi announced a holy war against the U.S. occupation. He took responsibility for numerous acts of violence. He organized many suicide bombings and beheadings, hostage executions. Their social media website was full of horrific images. He was also behind one of the defining moments in Iraq's civil war, which was the bombing of the Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra on the 22nd of February in 2006. This Golden Dome Mosque is one of the holiest sites of Shia Islam. By attacking it and destroying the Golden Dome, Zarqawi essentially declared a war against Shiism, and Iraq, which was already polarized between its sectarian ethnic groups, descended quickly and deeply into a condition of civil war. The day after the bombing of the Golden Dome, there were 1,000 people killed in Iraq in reprisal attacks, as there was a spiral of violence involving the different sectarian groups. These conditions of sectarian polarization worsened with the election in April of Nouri al-Maliki, who became the prime minister of Iraq. Maliki was the head of the Islamic Dawa Party of Iraq, somebody who had many years of opposition to Saddam Hussein. Instead of pursuing a path of reconciliation, Maliki adopted a course of confrontation and targeted Sunni leaders, including the vice president, Tariq al-Hashimi. He removed from the military and police leading Sunni figures, essentially turning governance and the security structures of Iraq into a Shiite-led institution. A few months after Maliki assumed office, there were 2 U.S. F-16s that picked up an intercept identifying Zarqawi's whereabouts in a city called Bakuba, about 30 kilometers north of Baghdad. They dropped 2 500-pound guided missiles, and Zarqawi was killed as a result. The head of U.S. forces in Iraq at the time, General David Petraeus, initiated an approach which he called the surge. It involved deploying an additional 30,000 U.S. troops. The goal here was to create a political space so that Iraqis could start talking to each other, could form governance institutions, could bridge some of these sectarian divides. In order to counter the al-Qaeda extremists, he also reached out to the Sheikhs and the Sunni tribesmen in Anbar province and the western regions of Iraq. And he created something called the Sons of Iraq, or the Sunni Awakening. This essentially turned moderate Sunnis against these al-Qaeda extremists and played a very important role in stabilizing Iraq during the time. David Petraeus has, of course, taken credit for the surge. The credit is due the sheikhs and tribespeople who were the point of the spear in confronting al-Qaeda and in eliminating some of these violent extremists. But as is always the case, with Zarqawi's death, there were a long list of people ready to take his place. And one of the gentlemen with whom he had worked closely was named Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Baghdadi has recently declared himself the caliph of the Islamic State and is carrying on the tradition of jihad and holy war that Zarqawi initiated. With the Sunni extremists in retreat in Iraq, in 2011, many of the Sunni militants left Iraq and crossed the border into Syria. In fact, when you listen to interviews with Dick Cheney, he always talks about a policy to advance regime change in both Syria and Iraq. Because, like Zarqawi, he felt that the artificial division between Syria and Iraq that Sykes-Picot created needed to be destroyed. He envisioned a democratic democracy replacing it. But in a rather sort of ironic twist, he and Zarqawi share a worldview about realigning the map of the Middle East. So in 2011, Syria's civil war erupted. And Syria's civil war was essentially a sectarian conflict. Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, is an Alawite. Alawites are an offshoot sect of Shiism. A lot of the conflict that ensued in Syria was between the majority of the country, 80% Sunnis, and this elite Alawite clique. Many of the Sunni extremists from Iraq went and joined the al-Nusra Front and other jihadi groups in Syria. In the spring of 2014, the regime of Assad demonstrated remarkable resilience. And despite all the pressure that was being put on them, they retook the city of Homs in western Syria. And as a result of that, many of the Sunni fighters who were either homegrown in Syria or had come from Iraq went back across the border. Mansour Barzani, who's the head of the Mukhabarat, the intelligence agency of the Iraqi Kurds, was aware that these jihadis were massing for an attack on Mosul in June. And he notified the US government and the Iraqi government that such an attack was imminent. Those warnings were ignored. And on June 10th, ISIS stormed across the border. They seized Mosul. And instead of stopping there, they continued south between the two great rivers and came to within 25 kilometers of Baghdad itself. The Iraqi army, which had numbered about 750,000, completely collapsed as a result of this ISIS attack. And because of the extreme polarization within Iraqi society, resulting from Maliki's sectarian rule, many of the Sunni tribespeople, who in fact had participated as sons of Iraq or in the awakening, joined forces with ISIS. ISIS probably was initially a group of maybe 7,000 to 8,000 fighters. They were joined in the first days by 2,000 to 3,000 former Baathists. By the time they had made their way to the gates of Samarra and of Baghdad, their numbers had increased dramatically. The CIA recently issued a report indicating that there were probably 40,000 ISIS members who were now active in combat operations in Iraq. To its credit, ISIS demonstrated remarkable command and control. They were able to fight in multiple theaters, in Syria, in Iraq, and in Lebanon. Suddenly, a ragtag group of terrorists became a very well-established, well-financed, and well-equipped army. So when we think about who are the fighters in Iraq, and they are now about 50% from outside of Syria and Iraq. These foreign fighters come from Europe, they come from Tunisia, Afghanistan, from Turkey. It's estimated that there are probably 150 US passport holders in the ranks of ISIS, 500 British passport holders, 900 French. And the worry is that these foreign fighters who are learning terrorist techniques in the battlefield of Iraq are going to take those techniques back to their countries of origin. And then they'll be involved in terrorist activities back home. There's a lot of eyes on fighters in Iraq so that we can monitor and identify them. But as Lauren was asking before, it's entirely likely that they'll slip through Homeland Security's grasp. So we have to be ever vigilant that they don't come home and perpetrate terrorist activities here. The rush to join ISIS was largely among Sunnis who felt disenfranchised. Disenfranchised by governance in Iraq, which was polarized, but also disenfranchised in their countries of origin. And these are young people, they're adept at social media, but they just lacked education, they lacked economic opportunity. There was something romantic about going to Iraq and participating in these atrocities. There were women from around the world who were recruited. Fighters were told that if they die on the battlefield, there will be 500 virgins waiting for them in heaven. So there were some very effective recruitment techniques, bringing poor, uneducated, and impoverished Sunnis from around the world to Iraq, which became the front line in the struggle against Shiism and also against the West. When they came across the border and seized Mosul, they also seized lots of heavy weaponry from the Iraqi armed forces. The U.S. had spent $25 billion on an equipment training program between 2005 and 2013. And when the Iraqi army fled, they simply just left all of this sophisticated weaponry for ISIS to seize and to control. These were Humvees, these were APCs, these are mortars, a lot of heavy weaponry, a lot of armor. So suddenly this group became extremely well equipped. What I always found perplexing is how did they know how to run all this equipment? I mean, there must have been someone there helping them, training them. Because if you put me behind the wheel of an APC, I wouldn't know where the gear shift is. Somehow they were getting some training, and they used all of this made in USA, state-of-the-art equipment in order to ramp up their attacks in Iraq. They also were extremely well financed. What did they do when they got to Mosul? First thing was they went and robbed the bank. They went and robbed the Bank of Iraq, and they took $430 million out of the account. They also controlled oil wells, both in Raqqa in Syria and now in northern Iraq, and they were selling oil to Assad's regime in Damascus. They were also transporting oil to customers in Turkey. There's something called the Jihad Highway, which was run between the Turkish and Syrian borders. So there was this constant flow of new fighters, there was a constant flow of resources going out of the country. It's estimated that the income for ISIS right now is $4 million a day. So when we hear from President Obama that we're going to degrade and destroy ISIS's capabilities, part of what he's doing is targeting the oil wells so that the revenue stream gets interrupted. We saw reports of ISIS committing terrible atrocities. When they came into Mosul, they rounded up the Christian population there, which was historic and had been in place for many, many centuries, and they gave them a choice. Either convert, pay a tax, or we will behead you. Many hundreds of Christians in Mosul were simply killed, and the brides of these Christians were taken, and they became jihadi brides. They were awarded as spoils of war to the ISIS combatants. Meanwhile, they were very clever about using their public relations. They filmed all of this, and we've seen some of these reports on television, of hundreds of people lined up and executed. We've seen hostages that are beheaded. All of this was broadcast. And rather amazingly, instead of being a source of repulsion, this became a source of attraction to many Muslims around the world who flocked to Iraq to join their ranks. I find the practice of jihadi brides particularly heinous. My wife is a human rights and women's rights activist, so we spend a lot of our time talking about this terrorist tactic. It would have been bad for ISIS to have merely focused its aggression against Mosul and against Arabs as they made their way down towards Baghdad. But in the middle of this offensive, they pivoted and they targeted the Iraqi Kurds. there had been an understanding that was reached between Masoud Barzani, the president of Iraqi Kurdistan, and ISIS, essentially of no hostilities. ISIS promised not to attack the Kurds if the Kurds didn't attack them. But quite predictably, ISIS broke its word, and they used all of this equipment to make their way towards Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan. I had an invitation from President Barzani for dinner on the 10th of August. They pivoted and attacked Iraqi Kurdistan on the 3rd of August. I was in Mardin on the Turkish border with Iraq on the 8th of August when the airspace was closed and all commercial flights into Iraq were canceled. I had promised my daughters that I wouldn't do anything stupid, so when I contacted my Kurdish hosts, they said, "We can get you here. We just can't guarantee that we can get you out." So I figured that prudence being the better part of valor, that I would save my trip for some other date. I'll be going in a couple weeks' time. The attack on Erbil stalled because of U.S. intervention. The U.S. made a decision that it would start to launch airstrikes against ISIS positions. But this didn't happen easily. It was a result of real revulsion in Washington at the attack against Yazidis in an area called Shengal, which is on the Syrian-Turkish-Iraqi border, kind of a patchwork of territories. Yazidis are technically Kurds, but they follow a Zoroastrian religious practice. They're mystical, and their attack and murder at the hands of ISIS prompted a virulent response from the international community. There were tens of thousands of Yazidis who were killed, and another 50,000 of them who fled to Mount Sinjar, which is a historic place of refuge for Yazidis. And they camped out on the side of the mountain, surrounded by ISIS fighters. Had the U.S. not intervened at that juncture, ISIS would have overrun the mountain, and all of those people would have been killed. Stopping the aggression of ISIS was one thing, but getting them off the mountain to a place of safety was another. And it was actually the Kurds of Syria, the PYD, joined by the PKK, a Turkish Kurdish group, that opened a humanitarian corridor and then physically escorted the Yazidis off the mountain through ISIS lines into Rojava, an area in Syria which was considered to be a safe haven. So the U.S. was reluctant to get involved, despite all these atrocities. And President Obama laid down a marker. And he said, we will only get involved once Iraqis establish a government of national unity. The solution here is not a security solution, it's not a humanitarian solution. It has to be a political fix. And fundamentally he was right, but that approach was overtaken by events. Because the U.S. couldn't just stand by and let Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, where there are thousands of Westerners living and 1 million Iraqi Kurds, simply be overrun. Especially after what happened with the consulate in Benghazi in Libya. There's no way that President Obama could have just stepped aside and let the U.S. consulate in Erbil also be overrun. Also, the images from Mount Sinjar of the Yazidis were very compelling. You had CNN journalists in the helicopters that were there delivering humanitarian assistance, just showing images of people who were hysterical from want and fear. So initially the response of the Obama administration was to stop the advance of ISIS. And I've been very critical of the lack of response that came from Washington, but I've also given credit where credit is due. In every instance where the U.S. has ramped up its military action, it's always done so at the very last moment, but just in time to save victims from a disaster narrowly averted. If the U.S. hadn't have started bombing the ISIS positions around Mosul, the city would have been overrun. So credit is due the administration for having launched airstrikes. Its first goal was to stop the advance of ISIS. Its second goal, in a classic case of Mission Creep, was to avert genocide. So it intervened around Mount Sinjar to bomb the ISIS positions there so that the Yazidis could be rescued. And its military campaign in Iraq continued to evolve towards a goal of retaking territory. The Mosul Dam had been seized by ISIS. It's a strategic spot. If ISIS had decided to blow it, there would have been a wall of water that would have rushed down the Mesopotamian plains and destroyed hundreds of villages in its path. So it started a campaign not only of airstrikes, but of arming the Kurdish fighters, who were called Peshmerga. Peshmerga is a Kurdish term. It means those who stand before death. Lauren was asking earlier, am I scared when I go to these places? And I told her, I'm not, because I'm surrounded by Peshmerga. They are assigned to protect me. And even though they didn't perform particularly well during the initial attacks on Sinjar, with the delivery of weapons from different governments, they were able to step up and play a very important role protecting Iraqis and Iraqi Kurds. It should be noted that the first delivery, the first C-130 that came and landed in Erbil, didn't come from the United States. It came from Iran. Iran was the first country to bring weapons to the Iraqi Kurds, and over the years there have been friendly relations between the Kurds and the Iranians, but Iran was not alone. We then stepped in, and there were 9 countries that have been providing weapons to the Iraqi Kurds as of today. Interestingly, a lot of those weapons are light arms, they're ammunition. The Kurds are crying out to the U.S. for more sophisticated weaponry, for anti-armor piercing equipments. The only country that's actually delivered that kind of weaponry is Germany. And Germany, because of its post-World War pacifist tradition, has never played this role. But the risk of Iraqi Kurdistan falling and the imperative of having local boots on the ground to counter ISIS is so strong, the Kurds are essentially playing that role. In Libya, the Obama administration, in its own words, adopted a policy of leading from behind. And this was essentially implied putting NATO first, letting other countries take the lead with U.S. logistics and infrastructural support. In Iraq, that just simply wasn't possible. Iraq was broken as a country because of President Bush's invasion and occupation. For the U.S. to have led from behind and allowed other countries to take the lead in trying to rescue Arabs and Kurds from ISIS simply would have been an abrogation of its political and moral responsibility. So the U.S. did step up. They have been providing a lot of support. They've been putting a lot of pressure on Iraqis to form a government of national unity. With participation from Iran, Maliki did eventually step down. He was replaced by a new prime minister from the Dawa Islamic Party called Haider al-Abadi. Abadi is by nature more conciliatory, but forming a government of national unity is a difficult task. The very sensitive positions of the defense and the interior ministries weren't filled until a couple of weeks ago. Forming a government is just part of a national reconciliation plan. Then you have to start governing. You have to show that you're providing security and services and humanitarian needs, populations in need. So Iraq remains deeply fragile. I worked for President Bush on the Future of Iraq project. And I ran something called the Democratic Principles Working Group, which was supposed to consider all of the challenges to Iraq after Saddam was removed. We were looking at the role of religion, creating effective judiciary, power sharing, ethnic and minority rights. In fact, the Iraqis called it the mother of all working groups, because we were tasked with all of the hardest issues. Those are the same issues that have bedeviled Iraq from that day, in 2003 March, when we launched our attack, and which still confront the country. It's my view, and I wrote about this in one of my books called Losing Iraq, that Iraq is essentially broken, that it's a failed state. The likelihood of restoring Iraq as a place of coherence and passivity is just not feasible. Nonetheless, the Obama administration is committed to trying to make Iraq stand up and be solvent. I just don't think that that's a reasonable project. In my view, Iraq is a failed state. It's joined by Syria, which is now also a failed state. And the U.S. is left with very few policy options and very few friends in those countries. If there's anything that Iraqis agree upon, it's their shared hatred of the United States. The only exception to this is the Iraqi Kurds. So when I think about a solution going forward, and I promised you some solutions, not only a litany of problems that we have created. And my view is that our policies in Asia Minor and Mesopotamia should be working with our friends instead of trying to placate our adversaries. And when I think of our friends, I think about the Kurds in Iraq, the Peshmerga, who are defending Iraqi Kurdistan. I'm also thinking about the role that the Kurds have played in Syria. There's an autonomous region in Syria called Rojava, and many of you have heard recently about the Battle of Kobani. Kobani is a city right on the Turkish-Syrian border. It was defended against ISIS, against an onslaught by ISIS, by the PYD fighters, the People's Protection Units. They were joined by PKK fighters who are technically on the U.S. list of terrorist organizations. For a month, they were able to withstand the ISIS onslaught. They fought street to street, and they were starting to run out of ammunition, and then the U.S., again, at the last minute, but effectively came to their aid. We started bombing ISIS positions on the western side of Kobani. We airlifted weapons into Kobani so that the People's Protection Units could defend themselves. We put a lot of pressure on Turkey, which was just standing aside and watching this massacre occur, to allow Peshmerga to traverse through Turkey into Kobani. They admitted 155, but they brought weapons, and that's better than nothing. So when I think about our friends in the region, I'm not just thinking about the Kurds in Iraq. I'm also envisioning a coalition that involves the Kurds of Syria and also the Kurds in Turkey. We should be taking the PKK off the terrorist list. There is a political dialogue going on with the PKK. There's been a ceasefire for several years. They've shown remarkable mettle in confronting ISIS. Right now, despite claims by President Erdogan in Turkey that the PKK and ISIS are equal terrorist organizations, we should be steely-eyed in evaluating the PKK, making some hard choices, and recognizing that as a Kurdish coalition in opposition to ISIS is our best way forward. And this is not just a symbolic coalition. What I envision is a new independent state called Iraqi Kurdistan that will confederate with the Syrian Kurdish territories of Rojava. This will be a democratic source of emulation in the region. It will affect the 10 million Kurds who live in Iran. It'll give a boost to the democracy initiative in Turkey, but it will only work if the U.S. stands behind the Kurds and recognizes that they are our best and our only friends in the region. So I'm very pleased to share with you some of my personal experience, to recognize problems that were created by the United States through its invasion of Iraq, the slow response by the Obama administration of dealing with ISIS, but ultimately and finally an effective response. But there is no security solution to what's going on. We can use our sophisticated weaponry to help the Kurds, but we need to have an end state in mind if we're going to have a strategy. President Obama famously said, well, we don't have a strategy yet for dealing with ISIS. You can't have a strategy and a set of goals unless you can envision an arrangement as an end state that will help to keep the region stable and calm. And in my view, that end state is called Iraqi Kurdistan. I also think the end state requires a generational approach to the Muslim world. We're not going to try or succeed in killing every extremist, if we're going to drain the swamp of support for groups like ISIS, the only way that we're going to be able to do that is through education, through economic development, by addressing the UN deficits that are identified for the Arab world. The amount of money that we spend on warfare can be diverted in part towards development goals, development challenges. None of this will happen unless the U.S. leads, not from behind, but in front. So in all of my discussions in Washington, it's always about the U.S. doing more. The American public opinion is important. Your voice is heard on election day. Your voice is heard through the media. Fora like these are an important opportunity to think about where we are and where we need to go. And for this reason, I'm so glad to be with you and to have accepted your invitation to share these thoughts. So thank you all. Sheila, I promised you 40 minutes, and you'll know that it's exactly 40 minutes later. And I'm very happy to answer any questions. This gentleman.
Yeah, hi, I'm Professor Culhane here at Mercy College, and I was in Erbil last year working on development projects, building biodigesters with both Kurds and Sunnis and Shiite at the U.S. Embassy and in the environment. I'm curious as to what your thought is about the integration of Iraqi Sunnis and Shiites who live in Erbil or working with Westerners like myself who went over, and what you think a well-supported Kurdistan would look like in terms of development goals vis-a-vis the other Iraqis. I'm Iraqi-American myself from Mosul, so obviously we're not Kurds, but we've always had a long tradition of getting along with the Kurds. What do you see happening politically in that dimension if Kurdistan became our focus for the non-Kurdish Arabs?
So it should be noted that there are three waves of refugees that have come to Iraqi Kurdistan. During the period of the surge, there were Arabs from other parts of Iraq. With the outbreak of civil war in Syria in 2011, there were Syrian Kurds and other Syrians coming to Iraqi Kurdistan. And now, with ISIS's move in Anbar and attack against Iraqi Kurdistan, a third wave of refugees. There are 1.6 million refugees that Iraqi Kurdistan is serving as host to. And the Kurds are a population of 4.5 million. So you can imagine the economic and other effects of so many people coming in. The Kurds and the Shia were always the twin pillars of opposition to Saddam. And that coalition still exists. The Kurds always served as the kingmaker when it came time to forming a government in Iraq. No other party was able to do it without the Kurds joining the coalition. And when Tariq al-Hashemi was targeted by Maliki, where did he go for safety? He went to Sulaymaniyah. He lived in Jalal Talabani's guest house. I stayed there myself. Well, I have a feeling that Mr. Hashemi got a little bit better service than I did. I did get a Persian carpet and a big bag of pistachios. So Kurdistan is a symbol of plurality, of toleration. There's a lot of economic cooperation. I really think it can be a magnet for pro-democracy groups in Iraq and the region, and serve as an example for how a people under siege can show favor, hospitality, and offer service to others who are in need. So.
A lot of the Sunni army officers who were kind of thrown out or pressured out of the Iraqi army went over to ISIS. I would figure that a lot of those guys are pretty secular. Is there any possibility that ISIS is going to be split because they're getting people who are not all this, have this jihadi ideology?
So you're right on both counts. A lot of the Ba'athist officers who were so alienated by Maliki's governance did welcome ISIS when they came across the border. There have also been increasing conflicts between ISIS commanders and former Ba'athist commanders, not necessarily over their jihadi practice, but the assumption that ISIS is making of primary rule. The reason why Ba'athists came and joined their ranks is because they saw this as an opportunity to regain their country. There have also been a number of local clerics, local Sunni clerics, who have opposed the very extreme brand of Sunni Islam that ISIS espouses. And there are dozens of reports of clerics who have been killed and communities, villages of Sunni Arabs that have turned against ISIS. Just last week, north of Baghdad, there was a village of Sunni Arabs that was overrun by ISIS. And you probably saw reports about it in the international media. All the residents of that village were rounded up and executed. So if there is a possibility to replicate the surge and the strategy of a Sunni awakening, it would be extremely useful and in the interest of Iraqis to do so. Now, ultimately, Iraqis have to come together and they need to oppose ISIS. The Kurds need to have good relations in Baghdad if they are to become independent. There are a lot of issues that have to be negotiated. Sharing of revenues over oil, water from the Tigris and Euphrates, the assets that have been invested by the Iraqi government to date. So your points are well taken in both regards. So,
How you doing, sir? I served in Kirkuk 2006, 2007, and a civil affairs team supported the 101st at the time. And I agree with you 100% in the fact that the Peshmerga and those that live in that area of Kurdistan are very resilient and just strong and motivated fighters to improve their country. You know, for one, they've always been more receptive to change, positive change, and moving forward, in my opinion, from our work out there. And I understand that they, for a long time now, have sought independence. From my understanding, from speaking to our interpreters, some of the local nationals in that area, the oil fields has been a problem with that, because a lot of the oil money that sustains Iraq comes from that region. How do you circumvent that issue?
so there are two issues that you've raised. One is the status of Kirkuk, and the other is the ownership of the oil fields. When the Iraqis negotiated their constitution in 2005, the constitution included Article 140, which called for a referendum in Kirkuk on its future status by December 31 of 2007. That was a core negotiating point for the Kurds, because no Kurdish leader could ever give away Kirkuk, because it's like their Jerusalem. To this day, that referendum has not been held. And if there is an entity called Iraqi Kurdistan that stands up as Iraq falls down, it will have Kirkuk as its capital. One of the first things that the Peshmerga did when ISIS came in and seized Mosul was to seize additional territories in Kirkuk and the related internally disputed boundaries of Kanakat. So ownership of Kirkuk for the Kurds is extremely important. I know the governor of Kirkuk, Najmuddin Karim, has bent over backwards to try to protect and promote minority rights. On my last trip to Iraq, about 10 months ago, Najmuddin sent a hard-shell vehicle to Erbil to bring me to him so we could have lunch together. He and I met first in 1988 when I was in Washington running the Congressional Human Rights Foundation. He's a brain surgeon from Maryland, and he brought into my office photos of Kurds who were victims of chemical weapons attacks in Halabja. And I speak very fondly of Naj and my books on the subject because he was the person who introduced me to Kurdish issues. And we're still very close. Your other point about the oil is also critical. Part of the negotiation between Baghdad and Erbil was a revenue sharing deal. And in that arrangement, Iraqi Kurdistan was to receive 19% of the total oil revenues for Iraq. There was a dispute of interpretation about the ownership of future oil revenues. The Kurds said the revenue split was only for existing wells, and that they were entitled to develop new wells, which they did do. And they built a pipeline from Erbil to the eastern Mediterranean port of Ceyhan. That pipeline is shipping 200,000 barrels of oil a day. Kurds are oil rich. There are 45 billion barrels of oil in Iraqi Kurdistan. The Iraqi government said, this is a bogus deal. We had a revenue sharing arrangement. you don't own this oil, and you can't ship it. So they cut off the provision of 19% starting in January of 2014. The way the Kurds reacted to this was to say, well, if you're going to cut off our revenue sharing, then we're just going to intensify our own energy development. It remains to be seen how they're going to resolve this impasse over revenue and royalty sharing. And who's going to own these new wells that have been built by Exxon, Chevron, Total, big major energy companies. And the way the Kurds have structured it is not as royalty sharing, but as co-ownership with these international companies. So now these companies, including these big U.S. firms, they have a stake in what happens in Iraq and Kurdistan. They're not going to walk away from it. They make money. And they're also going to use their influence in Washington with the executive branch to make sure that what they've spent doesn't disappear. So you put your finger on two very important issues. Saul?
Yeah. Speaking of oil producing, and for that matter, friends of the United States government, and for that matter, sometimes supporters of Sunni extremism. Can you finish the rest of the sentence?
I'm not sure.
There's some states in the Persian Gulf which are pretty good friends of the United States. There's a track record, not of the states themselves, but of some other sub-state actors providing support for Sunni extremism. And of course, there's a lot of money with which to provide that support. So you mentioned before, let's focus our attention on potential or traditional American friends that we have in the region. These are traditional American friends. So how do you react to that?
So what Saul is referring to are the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council.
Persian Gulf.
And countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, they haven't shown themselves to be very good allies in this fight against ISIS. In fact, most of the funding for these Sunni extremist groups that were fighting in Syria came from the Persian Gulf countries. Our relationship now with the Gulf states, I would characterize as purely transactional. We used to have a strategic vision that we shared with them. That strategic vision has been eroded by events. Now we cooperate when it's in our shared mutual interest. And I would also put in that transactional category U.S. relations with Turkey. Now, Turkey is a NATO ally. It was always the eastern flank of NATO. Then Prime Minister Erdogan was adamant about overthrowing Assad. When President Obama drew a red line, said that we would respond to chemical weapons attacks and then subcontracted U.S. foreign policy to Russia to enforce that red line through a chemical weapons disposal program. Erdogan intensified official Turkish government support for jihadi groups. And I've run afoul of Mr. Erdogan because I've written and testified about his role, providing logistics, weapons, financing. ISIS fighters are being treated in Turkish hospitals. I'm just finishing a research paper which documents Turkish media sources of official complicity with ISIS. And this is not just an isolated incident. When we think about NATO and the North Atlantic Alliance, it's not just a security alliance. It's also an alliance of shared values. And ever since Gezi Park in June of 2012, when Erdogan cracked down on peaceful pro-democracy, environmental protection protesters, and demonstrations spread to 60 countries, and there were mass arrests and disappearances. In my view, Turkey has fallen out of favor with the United States. And there should be a serious review about Turkey's suitability to remain a member of NATO. We need to rely on our allies, and Turkey has shown itself unreliable in this crisis. In places like Ukraine, when NATO may be called upon to provide assistance, can Turkey be counted on? I'm not sure.
So sorry, let's go back to the Gulf states for just one moment, if you don't mind. So you also spoke about cultural change in that part of the world. What leverage does the United States? You say, well, these are just transactional partners now. You don't think that they're still American allies?
So did you see the price of Brent crude this morning? It was $75 a barrel. And a few months ago, it was $112. So countries like Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Russia that are solely reliant on energy revenues have taken a huge hit. I don't know if that makes the Gulf states more or less compliant, but I do know that an effective regime, an effective government in Washington needs to maintain those important alliances, and we should be putting on a full court press with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states with whom we cooperated a lot in the past to make sure that they're cooperating now with the U.S. and the international coalition on ISIS. So far, they seem to be making signals that they are prepared to cooperate. Saudi Arabia offered a training base for the so-called moderate Syrian opposition. But as it's often said in Washington, people should be judged by what they do, not by what they say. And the jury's still out. Good, lots of questions. Let's go to this lady here.
Hi, thank you for coming. It's been a really fascinating talk. But my question is, I'm interested to hear your take on what you think about the possibility of the fall of Baghdad. If you think that ISIS will invade Baghdad and what the potential impact of that might be.
So ISIS is about 10 kilometers from the Baghdad International Airport. And that's pretty close to being able to invade Baghdad. When you listen to Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he says that Baghdad is secure. Baghdad is also a big city. It's largely a Shiite city. There are many Shiite militia groups that are active in and around Baghdad. Also, Kamal Soleimani, who heads the Quds force from Iran, was on the ground in Iraq the day that ISIS invaded. He and other Quds force members are physically present. They appeared in the battlefield. So when you combine the Iranian force, the Shia militias, the Iraqi army, which is trying to restore itself, I think that Baghdad is pretty safe. For the life of me, I'm not sure how ISIS has been able to achieve its battlefield victories. I think it just scares the wits out of people in its path. But when it comes to Baghdad, that's another order of business. Sorry. Okay.
Kind of two questions in one. I support your solution to support the British people, but do you think it's too easy of a solution? Would we be repeating the same thing as supporting Al-Qaeda to fight this side, or supporting Shias to fight the Sunnis? And the second part is, would it be an alternative to kind of split up Iraq into multiple regions to kind of find a way to fix the problem instead of kind of giving Iraq a blank check to start over? After what ISIS has done, can people kind of forget what's happened? The massacres, the former genocides, can people just move on from that? Or would we better just split up the region into multiple states?
So there are no easy solutions. There's no quick fix. And like the division of India and Pakistan, there's going to be a lot of violence. It would be best if Iraqis met the security challenge, if they adopted an attitude of compromise and accommodation. That's just not something that we've seen in Iraqi culture. So I support efforts by Iraqis to create a government of national unity. That would be best. I just don't think it's going to happen. And even if they do, can it really govern effectively? Can it control its territory? Can it provide services and security? No, I just don't think that's the case. So the first part of your question about the Kurds. The U.S. strongly opposes an independent Iraqi Kurdistan. When the Kurdish oil has been loaded onto tankers, the U.S. has intervened with governments in Morocco. It intervened with ports in Texas to block the offload of that oil. And the reality is that Iraqi Kurdistan isn't viable as a state unless it can protect itself and it has access to international oil markets. And it can't protect itself unless the U.S. is helping. And right now it can't access international oil markets unless Turkey is on its side. And despite the so-called strategic partnership between Ankara and the Kurdistan regional government, when push came to shove, Turkey really let the Kurds down. When ISIS was advancing on Erbil, I know firsthand that a senior Kurdish official flew to Turkey met with the National Security Advisor and the head of National Intelligence and pleaded with the Kurds to help them. And pleaded with the Turks to help them, excuse me. And the response was, we have a presidential election coming on August 10th. You know, we can't do anything until then. Then they went back to the well. They asked for help again. And the Turks responded by saying, ISIS has taken 49 Turkish hostages. As long as they have Turkish hostages, there's nothing we can do. So is Iraqi Kurdistan viable? I thought when ISIS invaded Mosul that that would be the trigger event that would lead to Iraqi Kurdistan's independence. When ISIS pivoted and attacked the Kurds, you know, that whole scenario changed. And the realization of an independent Iraqi Kurdistan has been deferred, it's been delayed, but it hasn't been destroyed. And it can still be achieved if the U.S. Is steely-eyed and takes real measure of who are our friends and allies. We're just really not at that point. If Baghdad is unable to govern, we might get to that point. We might have to bring Turkey along, but we're clearly not there yet. So we've got a bunch of questions. Let me see if I can bunch them together. Let's start with you. We'll do two at a time.
I know you mentioned before that the siege of Mosul, there was a warning about it. I would like to know maybe why that warning was ignored. And also, I guess for the lack of better words, why do you think ISIS has made so much progress in what seems to be such a short space of time? I know you mentioned like Sunnis felt disenfranchised and maybe not agreeing with their governments, or maybe because of people like that, that's why it's making so much progress, or was it like an ongoing process since the beginning?
Okay. Other question? Second question? Sure.
Right, as a Turkish American, I just want everybody to know that Turkey is a very divided country on this opinion. So Erdogan is definitely not supported by a lot of people in Turkey, including myself. And also my mother lives close to the Syrian border, so I'm very interested in this question. Do you feel that the PKK, and I grew up with anti-PKK sentiment, but it's not one I share. I'm actually very sympathetic to Kurds. Do you feel that PKK represents a real threat to Turkey? And what is your understanding of their actual, Turkey's always been resistant against Kurdistan because of their they feel they want to steal all the territory in Turkey. What are your feelings about the reality of the PKK threat to Turkey?
Well, thanks for asking such an easy question. let me answer her question. I'll get to yours. So, why did ISIS make such progress? It was because they invaded the western provinces, Nineveh, Anbar, Diyala, where there are large Sunni populations, and they found that the Sunni tribes and the Sunni residents there were sympathetic to their message. They might not have been sympathetic to terrorist atrocities, but because they've been so abused by Maliki's government and Baghdad, they didn't oppose them. What was the first part of your question? I wrote it down, but I can't read what I wrote.
The warning was ignored? I know you said.
Oh, right. So I'm sharing with you some intel that I got about the warning. It was ignored because Washington just didn't want to deal with it. President Obama ran on a platform of withdrawing from Iraq. When the Status of Forces Agreement was being negotiated in 2011, the U.S. initially wanted to keep a residual force to do some training and some rapid response in the event of a terrorist incursion. They couldn't get Maliki's government to agree to an immunity deal for U.S. soldiers and contractors, primarily contractors. So Obama was more than pleased to just walk away from Iraq and have claimed that the U.S. troops were out of the country. ISIS is coming back into Iraq. For President Obama, it's his worst nightmare because it's forced the United States to re-engage. We can't allow a genocide to happen. We can't allow a country to fall. We can't allow a country like Iraq to become a center of jihadi extremism in the Middle East. So in many ways, President Obama was left with few choices. So the subject of the PKK, I gave an interview last night to a Turkish paper that I'm sure will prevent me from traveling to Turkey for the foreseeable future. I think the PKK should be taken off the terrorist list. It was put on the terrorist list as part of a deal after 9/11. Turkey agreed to take the lead in ISAF, and International Stabilization and Assistance Force for Afghanistan. There was a fix. The PKK would be listed as an FTO. The EU and the UK and other European governments followed suit after we did that. The reality is that the PKK is loved by Kurds in Turkey because it stands against the Turkish state that was committing terrible abuses against the Kurds. There were 40,000 people killed during this conflict between the PKK and the state. And most of those were civilians. Many of those were killed by counterterrorism operations. There were several million people displaced. There were thousands of villages that were affected by a scorched earth policy. So what the PKK did is they stood up for Kurdish rights. Abdullah Öcalan, the head of the PKK, which is now in prison on Imrali Island, is revered by Kurds because he stood against a far superior force and gave dignity to the Kurds. And while he's in jail, he's been negotiating with Hakan Fidan, who is the head of the National Intelligence Agency, NID. They negotiated a ceasefire, a withdrawal of forces. There was an active democracy opening that was announced by Prime Minister Erdogan. There was a golden opportunity for there to be a real, durable, and lasting peace with the PKK. And the government just wasn't serious about it. So the PKK has now shown itself as an effective counterweight to ISIS. We should recognize that it helped to save Kobani. We should encourage the government of Ankara to rejoin that political dialogue with the PKK. And in order to give momentum to those discussions, the U.S. should take the PKK off of its terror list. It'll send a very clear signal that we recognize that this is a pivotal moment and that all Turkish citizens, including those of Kurdish origin, need to have a voice that's heard at this time.
I would agree with that. Thank you.
Not a very popular opinion in Ankara. And where your mother is from, in Hatay province, I assume?
Well, she's actually in Alanya, but she travels a lot in that direction, and we have a lot of relatives in that area, so I'm a little concerned about that. But there's a lot of people against Erdogan in Turkey right now. It's very divided.
It's very divided, but they did just have presidential elections, and Erdogan did win in the first round with 52% of the vote. And he wins because the AK Party, which he runs, has given lots of business and money to his political base, which is Islamist, in the Anatolian heartland. Those companies have then reinvested in the AK Party. So there's a kind of a corrupt loop that has been established in Turkey that has allowed Erdogan to consolidate his political support. The real test is going to be when they have national elections for parliament, which I think are going to be scheduled for next spring. And what Erdogan wants to do is what Putin did in Russia. He wants to change the constitution, establishing a strong executive, a presidential system. You saw this story in the New York Times last weekend about the Aksaray Palace that he's built.
Right.
This is a $350 million home. I just renovated a home in Irvington. It didn't even cost me half that much. And it's got 1,000 bedrooms. So he wants to be in power on the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the Turkish Republic. And Erdogan is truly delusional in his sense of self-grandeur.
I agree.
So I think maybe we're just going to take two last questions because you want to have a little reception, right, Sheila?
I know. President Hall would like to.
Okay. Well, let's take these two last questions in President Hall. Can I turn the floor to you? Okay. Gentleman in the back.
Sir, first of all, I would like to thank you for your wonderful insights on ISIS and the conflicts that are occurring in Iraq, Syria, and other places. Now, you mentioned about a lot of important points, but one of the most striking points for me from your speech today is that a lot of people who are living here in the United States, who are citizens here, from a literal perspective, although they are citizens of the United States, they still sympathize with ISIS and ISIS cause and the conflicts in Iraq and Syria and so forth. From a terrorism point of view, these people pose a significant threat to our safety and well-being in the United States because these people can function as lone wolf terrorists. Now, as a very adept and knowledgeable security expert as you are, what is the U.S. government doing to identify these people? And if they do identify them, what are the legalities involved in processing these people from a legal perspective? Would they put these people through the justice system? Would they deport these people? What is your take on that, sir? Thank you.
I'm not allowed to discuss it. Since I'm not a U.S. official, I can't discuss it. There's a lot of monitoring, there's a lot of wiretapping, there are websites and social media which are constantly being surveyed. I was with the FBI director the other morning who described a very extensive Homeland Security network which is looking at these lone wolf and homegrown terrorists. So, you know, we are ever vigilant, but that doesn't mean that we have a foolproof system. Do you have a question?
No, that's right.
So let me just stop here.
Oh, that's all right.
Let me not stop here.
That's all right. My question was, I wanted to hear some insights from you on the rationale for the massive civilian assassinations by the leaders of the Islamic State.
So I'm not sure that rationale is the right word, because that implies that it's a reasoned position. Part of the ISIS strategy is, as a terror group, is to terrorize people. And the way that it controls territory and subdues opponents is by instilling fear. So when people are beheaded, and their beheadings are broadcast, when Brits and Americans are shown with their heads chopped off, it sends a very clear message to great powers, it sends a message to other Iraqis and Syrians that ISIS will stop at nothing. So it's proven to be an effective way of controlling the population, but if ISIS is serious about being an Islamic state, it's going to have to show an ability to govern, not simply to terrorize. And it hasn't shown that, it hasn't shown a desire or a capacity. So I think in the long run, you know, there is hope for forces of moderation. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Presidents know better than stand long in between an audience and a reception. That's not a good place to be, so I don't want to take time. But to thank Dr. Phillips for being here and addressing this issue of international importance, and to thank Dr. Sheila Gersh and the Center for Global Engagement for providing programming like this for our students, and to thank our students here. You know, this is my first academic semester here in New York, my first time to see many of our students up close and at hand, and I'm very impressed. I'm impressed with how engaged you are with the life and the world around us. I look forward to being a part of this community. I look forward to you being able to maybe talk to us some more as you serve as a visiting scholar. I know we're very happy to have you, and thank you for your lecture.
Thank you very much. So let me preempt Dr. Gersh's remarks. I think there's a reception here, and you're all welcome to linger, and I'm happy to speak with you until our closing hour at 6. So thank you all.
Maybe so.